Alcohol is the most widely used central nervous system depressant, but it's not the only central nervous system depressant. Sedatives and hypnotics also fall into that category. Sedatives are drugs that reduce your level of arousal, and hypnotics are drugs that tend to put you to sleep. Sometimes the same drugs have both properties. Included in this category are barbiturates that have been around for decades and are highly subject to abuse, and benzodiazepines that are relatively new, although they've been around for 50 years or more, but tend to be safer. We often refer to drugs that affect anxiety as anti-anxiety drugs or anxiolytics. Those are essentially synonyms. And drugs that put you to sleep as hypnotics. Now both of the drugs I've talked about affect GABA. Remember, GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Barbiturates increase GABA efficiency, so you have more of this effect, this inhibitory effect. Benzodiazepines increase the activity of GABA, again, producing more of the inhibitory effect. Now, both are addictive, although barbiturates are more addictive and they are dangerous, or more dangerous. To give you an idea, you can die from as few as a dozen barbiturates if they're combined with alcohol. Now, many people use barbiturates, or at one time used barbiturates as sleeping pills. So they might, if they're having trouble fall asleep, try a couple of stiff drinks and then take some barbiturates. And they're still not falling asleep, so they drink a little more or they take some barbiturates, and they may not remember how many they've had, so they accidentally kill themselves. In contrast, benzodiazepines are not terribly lethal. The original benzodiazepine was Valium. It came in 3 different size tablets, 2, 5, and 10 milligrams. The minimum lethal dose of the 10 milligrams was 1,600 tablets. So if you had a prescription of 100 and you took all of them, you would fall asleep, but you'd wake up. Eventually, you just sleep for a while because of the effect. You wouldn't die from it. If depressants depress the activity of the central nervous system, you won't be surprised that stimulants do just the opposite. They stimulate the activity of the central nervous system, so they make you feel more energetic, more awake. The cup of coffee that you see there is the most widely used stimulant, and it is indeed a drug, caffeine, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But also in the category of stimulants are cocaine and amphetamines, which we'll talk about shortly. Cocaine was at one point thought to be not terribly addictive. Wrong. It's very addictive and healthy for you. It certainly will make you feel more awake and allow you sometimes to pull all-nighters and be quite productive. But because of its addictive property, you can quickly reach the point where you physically need the cocaine to be able to function. Cocaine comes from the coca plant. In its pure form, it's normally snorted or smoked. Typically, if you're going to smoke it, you smoke it in the form of crack cocaine. We'll talk about that in just a minute. It energizes you. It makes you feel awake. Sigmund Freud was addicted to cocaine because at the time we didn't realize that it was dangerous. What makes it so addictive is it affects the pleasure center of the brain. It affects the dopamine that is so dominant in the pleasure center. So it gives you a massive high as well as this incredible level of energy. And it's very hard to treat. We'll talk about that later. The free-base version of cocaine, which is typically smoked, is called crack. By the way, if you're interested, it's called crack because of the sound that it makes when you're smoking it. It is more addictive than regular cocaine, largely because of the delivery mechanism. With all drugs, the faster the drug affects your central nervous system, the more addictive it will be. So when you smoke crack, the drug goes immediately into your lungs, immediately into your bloodstream. It's pumped out by the heart, and it literally goes from your heart directly up to your brain, a matter of seconds. So it's an immediate effect. Whenever you get a reinforcing effect that's faster, it tends to be more effective as a reinforcing effect. So you become addicted more quickly. If you snort it, it takes much longer for it to be absorbed into the bloodstream, circulated through the heart, and then eventually reach the brain. All forms of cocaine, though, are addictive, not just crack. The other bad thing about crack is it's cheap, which means that children who don't have a lot of money can often afford to buy crack cocaine. And most children who become addicted to cocaine are actually addicted to this freebase form. Amphetamines are also central nervous system depressant. Like a lot of drugs, amphetamines were developed for another purpose. They help to treat asthma. And they still work in that regard, although we tend not to use them to treat asthma anymore because we have other drugs that are less dangerous. But it didn't take long before people realized that it tended to keep you awake. And people who needed to be up all night, like long-haul truckers, would start using amphetamines. And other people noticed, well, they weren't very hungry. So it reduced your appetite. If you're trying to lose weight, not being hungry is a good thing. So people would start using it as a weight reduction tool. The modern form of amphetamines is called meth or methamphetamines. And you also have what is called crystal meth, sometimes called crank. These forms tend to be used recreational, especially when you want to have all-night dance parties and you want to have the energy to be able to dance all night. The all-night dance parties, by the way, are called raves, but you probably already knew that. Now, caffeine is also a stimulant, and it's the most widely used stimulant. Many people just can't get going until they have their first cup of coffee in the morning. But it isn't just coffee. Sodas, colas. My Diet Coke here, for example, has a fair amount of caffeine in it. Chocolate has caffeine in it. Now, caffeine is a mild stimulant, and it's short-acting. And short-acting means that it is quite addictive because it goes into your system quickly and then goes out of your system, and you feel it once it leaves your system. If you are a heavy coffee drinker and you stop drinking coffee, you probably notice that's not a good thing to do, because you will have the most god-awful headache, a migraine headache, because of the rapid reduction of caffeine. Okay, that's the equivalent of the DTs in alcohol. If you go off of it slowly, you can avoid that. But it isn't just the headaches. You'll feel depressed. You'll have a lack of energy. I mean, you just feel like all you want to do is lay there. The fatigue is so bad. There's huge sensitivity differences among people. I can drink 10 or 12 Diet Cokes a day. My father could drink 20 cups of coffee a day. I can have a cup of coffee at 10 o'clock and be sound asleep before 11. Some people, if they have a cup of coffee at 2 in the afternoon, they're not going to sleep that night. I studied with a professor in graduate school who had a tooth extracted, and they gave him 3 pills to control the pain over the next day or so. The pills were called APC. He didn't know that C stood for caffeine. He never drank coffee, never drank colas, or chocolate because he knew he was sensitive. He took one of those pills and didn't sleep for 3 days. Again, huge differences. Probably genetic in nature in terms of the sensitivity. Now, nicotine is another drug. It's a stimulant. It's also a depressant. In fact, nicotine is one of the most difficult drugs to classify. And depending on the textbook, sometimes it's given its own category, as I'm doing here. Sometimes it's put into other categories. We'll talk about that later. Caffeine is the addictive property in tobacco. So if you smoke cigarettes, what makes you want to smoke cigarettes more and makes it so hard to stop smoking is the nicotine. It's very short acting. And because you're smoking it, it goes into your system very quickly. Anyone who smokes can tell you that after there's been a period that they haven't been able to smoke, perhaps they're in a class or a meeting or something, and they get out and they smoke a cigarette, in a matter of seconds, they're feeling the effect of that cigarette. They're feeling better as a result of it. The problem isn't the nicotine. The problem is the delivery system for nicotine. As you will see, tobacco is very dangerous. Why is nicotine so addictive? This shows how quickly nicotine goes into your system after you smoke a cigarette, and notice how fast it comes out of your system. It comes out almost as fast as it went in. So once you become addicted to this drug, you need another dose of it very quickly because you're hurting. If you ever go to a conference where there's a 2-hour meeting or something, or get off of a plane that's maybe 4 or 5 hours and you haven't been able to smoke, you'll notice that most people go to one of two places. Many go straight to the bathroom because, well, the cup of coffee that they had before has kind of worked its way through the system and they need to go to the bathroom. There's another group that needs to go to the bathroom every bit as fast, but they go outside or to a smoking lounge and they do a cigarette because they need that more than they need to empty their bladder. It's because it takes so little time for the nicotine to leave your system that you are essentially desperate for more. Now, I mentioned that the delivery system is a real problem with nicotine because it's usually tobacco products. This graph will show you how many people die per year from various drugs. Tobacco is higher than all the other drugs put together. We think of alcohol as causing a lot of deaths, and it sure does. And illegal drugs in general causing a lot of deaths. In fact, most people who abuse heroin and cocaine have a very short life expectancy because of the complications associated with those drugs. But it's minuscule compared to the effects of smoking. And it isn't just loss of life. Smoking affects your health in a variety of ways and therefore makes the quality of your life long before you die much less. Why does it do that? On average, there are 1,200 chemicals in a typical cigarette. 1,200. Not one of them, not a single one is healthy. And most of them are unhealthy and some are highly carcinogenic, which means they tend to cause cancer. That's why smoking is so bad for you. The next class of drugs are opiates or opioids. You might wonder what's the difference. Opiates come from the poppy flower and plant, and opioids are synthetically manufactured in laboratories. Chemically, your body can't tell the difference. So one is a natural product, another is simply a manufactured drug. They're both called narcotics, and most people incorrectly believe the word narcotic simply means illegal drug. So cocaine is a narcotic just like heroin is. That's not correct. Narcotics mean that the drug tends to induce sleep. Narcolepsy, for example, is a sleep disorder. So narco means sleep. So narcotics are drugs that induce sleep. Now, opiates also do other things. They will decrease pain. And we use some of the opiates like morphine and OxyContin, which is an opioid, to treat pain. But they will make you sleepy as well. And in higher doses, you definitely will sleep. Opioids are usually in pill form, and unfortunately we're experiencing a terrible problem with opioid addiction in our country right now. In fact, in the state of Ohio, we have a horrible problem with opioid addiction. Opiates can be consumed in many different ways. They can be smoked. They can be inhaled, so smoked like marijuana or crack cocaine, inhaled as cocaine is, or they can be injected. By tradition, and it's really only tradition, they tend to be injected. Their fastest effect, though, is when they're smoking because they go into your bloodstream and affect the brain more quickly. They are highly addictive. It's very, very hard to treat opioid addiction. They depress the nervous system. That's how they produce sleep, and that's how they reduce pain. But the way they depress the nervous system mimics the natural painkillers called endorphins that our body has. Life is tough on our body, and we often have aches and pains that are the result of the things that we have to do to stay alive and function. But our body modulates those chemically with the endorphins. The problem is that opiates and opioids are so much more powerful than the endorphins of the body that they essentially take over the process, which means when you're not taking these drugs, there's no natural painkillers in your body, so you feel miserable. Normal aches and pains, with nothing to help you to modulate that pain. Cannabis, better known as marijuana, is the product of the hemp plant. Now, the hemp plant has been cultivated for years, used as a drug for a very long time as well, but most of the early cultivation was to make ropes. And in particular, the ropes made from hemp plants tended to not be damaged by salt water. So without the hemp plant, quite frankly, much of the early sailing adventures in which people from one country discovered other places on this planet would probably never have happened because other ways of making rope just wouldn't have lasted on an ocean voyage. Hashish is made from the resin of the hemp plant, and marijuana from the leaves and the flowers, which are typically crushed and dried and then formed into cigarettes. It was actually widely used before it was made illegal federally in 1937. And many states have recently made it legal, at least for medical purposes, and many for recreational purposes as well. It's an interesting conundrum, however, because it's still illegal at a federal level, even though it's legal at many state levels. One of the issues that creates is that no bank will touch the money associated with cannabis stores because it's drug money. And the bank can be seized by the federal government for laundering drug money. So much of the operation of the stores is done in cash out of necessity. You can't have a checking account because that goes through a bank. Many of the effects of cannabis are similar to the effects of alcohol. There's an intoxication. It happens more rapidly with cannabis, usually because it's smoked. than for alcohol. But it does happen. It usually takes 20 or 30 minutes to reach its peak, but you can feel it in less than a minute. And it lasts a relatively short period of time. Now, the intoxication is not due to alcohol, but to a drug called THC. But the interesting thing about THC is that the level in your bloodstream has no relationship to the level of intoxication. In contrast, the blood alcohol level is directly related to your level of intoxication and things you can and cannot do as a result of the intoxication. Which means that if a police officer pulls you over and you've been smoking marijuana, he or she will probably know it because it has a very distinctive smell. It's not a smell you can get rid of very easily either. But they won't be able to use a breathalyzer to see how intoxicated. But remember, the court recognizes a field sobriety test. And that's what they'll do. And if you fail this field sobriety test, that's called driving under the influence. By the way, it used to be driving under the influence of alcohol, but now it's just driving under the influence because it could be any drug, including cannabis. There's a lot of controversy about the longer-term effects of cannabis. There's no controversy about the long-term effects of alcohol. It's terrible on your body. You usually die before retirement age because of the damage it does if you drink heavily for a long period of time, and it does terrible damage to your brain. It's less clear how much damage is done, and part of the reason it's less clear is it's an illegal drug, at least federally, and therefore you can't do some of the controlled experiments that you can do with alcohol. And people are less likely to honestly report how much they smoke cannabis compared to people describing how much they drink alcohol. We do know that heavy smokers tend to be more apathetic, but it's not clear whether that's a cause or an effect. It may be that if you're not very motivated, you're apathetic, that the idea of smoking marijuana and just tuning out sounds wonderful to you. So the marijuana then is the effect of the apathy rather than something caused by the marijuana. I should tell you that the tar content, which is one of those 1,200 chemicals that are in cigarettes, it's much higher in marijuana cigarettes. And therefore, if you smoke a lot of marijuana, you're going to be at high risk for lung cancer and other diseases associated with cigarette smoking. It may affect fetuses. We don't know for sure. There's at least some evidence to suggest it may be the case. But we're never going to know now. Because once it becomes reasonable to suspect that it affects fetuses, we can't ethically ask women who are pregnant to smoke marijuana to see if something bad happens to their child. No, you just can't do that. At one time, it was thought to cause massive brain disease, massive brain deterioration. If you've ever seen the film Reefer Madness, which, by the way, you can find on the internet, it's a lot of fun. It's a joke. It basically says that if you smoke marijuana, you will go insane and your brain will be forever changed. Okay, that's clearly not true. That was a lie. And by the way, it was a really bad lie for two reasons. It was perpetrated at a time when there were enough people smoking marijuana to know that it was a lie. And second, once you start lying to younger people about the effects of drugs, you lose all credibility. So when you say that heroin and cocaine are dangerous, oh, you told me that about cannabis. I know better. Credibility is really important when you're dealing with real risks and you want to convince people of those risks. Technically, cannabis is often considered a hallucinogen. In our coverage, we gave it its own category. Hallucinogens are drugs that cause dramatic changes in perception, including visual and auditory and sensory hallucinations. That's why they're called hallucinogens. They've been used in religious ceremonies for centuries and are still used in many places as part of religious ceremonies. Those hallucinogens were part of natural substances like mescaline, which is a result of peyote cactus, or is found in a peyote cactus, or psilocybin, which is part of a particular kind of mushroom. There are hallucinogens that have been created in the laboratory. PCP at one time was popular for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is it was incredibly dangerous. It's not popular today, and I'm very glad of that. When I was in college, it was much more common. LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, is by far the most commonly known hallucinogen. Became popular in the 1960s and 70s, and its popularity waned, and then it came back, then it waned, and it came back. It's very easy to make. You can literally do it in your kitchen sink. And for that reason, if you want to have a hallucinogen, that's certainly one that you can do. All hallucinogens create mind-altering experiences, which is why they were considered important in religious ceremonies. During the drug culture era of the 60s and 70s, they were thought to be drugs that would expand the mind. There's not a lot of evidence that that actually happens. LSD is probably the best known of all the hallucinogens. It's a manufactured product, relatively easy to manufacture, literally in your kitchen sink. It's made famous primarily by a Harvard psychology professor named Timothy Leary, who originally had done experiments with LSD on trying to rehabilitate prisoners. It didn't work very well for that purpose, but in the process he had experimented with it and was convinced that it was a positive mind-altering drug, and encouraged college students of the day to use the drug on a regular basis. The CIA also experimented with LSD to use with interrogations of people that they might have captured who were spies. That didn't work very well either, and the evidence that in fact it is mind changing in a positive way is pretty limited. The one thing though that has remained since the 1960s is the pop art that's associated with the mind-altering experiences of LSD. The photo at the left here illustrates that kind of art. Note how it seems to pulse because of a illusion caused by the nature of the colors and the shapes. Another class of drugs that are abused are inhalants. These are volatile solvents, that is, liquids that will readily go into a gaseous state and therefore can be breathed in and absorbed through the lungs. The absorption is very rapid. Many of them will create symptoms, experiences, similar to, but usually not as powerful as many of the drugs that we talked about in this chapter. The real problem with them, though, is these are chemical substances that are often around the home, and so they tend to be used by children. What makes them really dangerous is they tend to be neurotoxins, which means they damage neurons, they cause brain damage, or carcinogenic agents. They increase dramatically the risk of cancer. They will develop, like all of the drugs, tolerance and withdrawal effects, but the damage often is to the physiology from using them. And again, they're used mostly by children, and children are particularly sensitive to these effects compared to adults. Anabolic steroids, often called androgenic steroids. Androgens are chemicals like testosterone. They're hormones produced by the body in males primarily, and they facilitate muscle growth. So if you have chemicals that look like testosterone, they will help you to grow more muscles. And for that reason, athletes that are in sports that require muscular development will sometimes use steroids. Now, generally, they're illegal. They're illegal in just about every sport you can imagine. If you're taking steroids and you get caught and you win a gold medal at the Olympics, they take it away from you because it's not a legitimate thing. In the sport of baseball, there are several people who have records that will always have an asterisk next to them because they almost certainly abuse steroids. In some cases, they put on 50 or 60 pounds of pure muscle in a year. There's no way to do that without drugs like this. Now, to be perfectly honest, I personally don't care if athletes making millions of dollars a year abuse their body. In fact, they do. Anyone playing football, whether they take steroids or not, is abusing their body, and they're probably going to pay the price. But they're getting millions of dollars a year. What's going to happen is the college students who want to get into sports are going to use steroids as a shortcut, and then high school students. And again, the younger people tend to be more affected by these drugs. The steroids not only promote muscle growth, but because they're so massive, they can affect one's sexual system, and they often lead to very aggressive and often out of control behavior. So people will have huge acting out periods where they might physically hurt people because of the effects of the steroids.